I'm Evelyn, 67 years old, living in a quiet little house on Maple Street, just outside Columbus, Ohio. My husband Carl and I have been married for 42 years. That's a long time, isn't it? Long enough to know every creak in the floorboards, every sigh he makes when he's tired. Long enough to forget what it feels like to be seen. Carl's a good man. Don't get me wrong. He's kind in that steady, predictable way, like how he always leaves his coffee mug in the same spot on the counter, or how he mows the lawn every Saturday, rain or shine. But somewhere along the way, we became more like ghosts to each other, passing through the same rooms without really touching. He works late most nights managing accounts at a logistics firm downtown. When he's home, he's buried in his newspaper or scrolling through his phone. I can't remember the last time he looked at me, really looked the way he used to when we were young, when I'd catch him staring and feel my cheeks burn. It's not that I'm sad exactly. I've got my routines to keep me busy. I tend the garden, watch my shows, and chat with the ladies at church on Sundays. I tell myself I'm fine, and most days I believe it. But there are moments, quiet ones, when the house feels too big and the clock ticks too loud, when I wonder if this is all there is. If I faded into the wallpaper of my own life, unnoticed, unneeded. I don't talk about it, though. Who would listen? Carl's got his work. Our daughter's busy with her kids in Chicago, and the neighbors, well, they're nice enough, but we keep to ourselves. Except for Tom, the boy, well man now, who lives next door. Tom's in his mid-30s, the son of our neighbors, Ed and Linda. He moved back home a few months ago, after some trouble out west. A divorce, I heard, though nobody talks about it. He's always been polite, ever since he was a kid, riding his bike up and down the street. Now, he's taller, broader, with a quiet way about him that feels heavier than it used to. He'll wave when he sees me watering the roses or offer to carry my groceries if he's around. Small things. But they stick with me. Maybe because they're the only things that do. It was a Thursday evening, one of those heavy Ohio nights where the air smells like rain before it even starts. I'd walked to the grocery store a few blocks away. Carl says I should drive, but I like the walk, even if my knees complain. I was at the checkout bagging my things when the sky split open. Rain came down in sheets drumming against the store's big windows. I stood there clutching my bags, staring at the parking lot like it was an ocean. Carl was still at work, and I'd tried calling him twice. No answer. I wasn't surprised, but it stung all the same, a little pinch in my chest. I told myself I'd wait it out, but the rain only got worse, and the store was closing soon. That's when I saw headlights cut through the downpour. A pickup truck pulled up close to the entrance, and for a second, I thought it might be Carl. But then I saw Tom step out his jacket, already soaked, as he jogged toward the door. Evelyn. He called, his voice warm, even through the storm. You need a ride. I hesitated. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm not used to accepting help. Or maybe because something about the way he looked at me, all earnest and steady, made my stomach flutter in a way it hadn't in years. But the rain was relentless, and my bags were heavy, so I nodded. That'd be real kind of you, Tom, I said, and followed him to the truck. The cab smelled like leather and pine air freshener, and the heat was on, warming my chilled hands. Tom didn't say much at first, just focused on the road, the wipers slapping back and forth. I thanked him again, told him I hadn't expected to get stranded like that. He smiled a small one and said, no trouble at all. I was just heading back from the hardware store when I saw you. His voice was low, easy, like we'd done this 100 times. I settled into the seat, watching the rain blur the world outside, and for a moment it felt safe. like I could breathe a little deeper. We talked about small things, how the neighborhood's changed, how his mom's been baking too many pies. I laughed, and it surprised me, the sound of it. I hadn't laughed like that in a while. But then the conversation slowed, and the quiet between us grew heavier, like the air before a storm gets worse. I glanced at him, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw set but soft. He was different from Carl. I thought to you. I pushed the thought away as soon as it came. Carl's hands were always restless, tapping or fidgeting. Tom's were calm, deliberate. I looked out the window, my reflection faint against the glass, and wondered why I was noticing things like that. The rain was still pounding when we pulled onto our street, the truck's tires splashing through puddles. I expected him to drop me off at the curb, but he parked right in front of my house, close to the porch, so I wouldn't get too wet. "You don't have to do that," I said, but he just shrugged, like it was nothing. He grabbed my bags from the back and carried them to the door, standing under the awning with me as I fumbled for my keys. The porch light was dim, casting shadows across his face, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker, like he was seeing me for the first time. Not Evelyn the neighbor, but Evelyn the woman. My heart skipped, and I told myself it was the cold, the rain, anything but what it felt like. "Thank you, Tom," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He nodded, but he didn't leave right away. He stood there, just a little too close, and said, "You take care, Evelyn. Don't let this storm keep you down." It was a simple thing to say, but the way he said it, the way his eyes held mine a second longer than they should have, made something inside me shift. Like a door I'd forgotten was there, had cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light through. I turned away, fumbling with the lock, and hurried inside without looking back. But as I closed the door, I could still feel his gaze, warm and heavy, lingering on me. If you're still with me, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who gets it. Let's dive back in. The next morning, the rain had softened to a drizzle, but the air still felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, staring out at the gray sky. Carl was already gone, left early for a meeting, his coffee mug still on the counter, half empty. I kept replaying the night before Tom's voice, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a neighbor being kind. But my hands trembled as I scrubbed a plate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a stone dislodged from a stream, letting the water flow a little differently. I saw Tom later that day, out in his parents' yard, fixing a loose fence post. He waved, and I waved back, quick and polite, before turning to my roses. I clipped a few dead blooms, my fingers moving faster than they needed to. I didn't want to linger, didn't want to give him a chance to come over and talk. But I couldn't stop glancing his way, noticing the way his shoulders moved under his flannel shirt, the way he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. It was foolish, I knew. I was old enough to be his mother, for heaven's sake. But there was something about him, something warm, something alive, that made me feel like I was waking up after a long, dreamless sleep. That evening, I was on the porch, sipping tea and watching the street settle into dusk. The air smelled clean, like wet earth, and the neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant hum of a lawnmower. I heard footsteps and looked up to see Tom walking over, a small paper bag in his hand. "Mom made too many cookies again," he said, holding it out with a grin. "Thought you might like some." I took the bag, my fingers brushing his for a split second, and my heart did that stupid skip again. "That's sweet of her," I said, setting the bag on the table. "You want to sit for a minute?" I don't know why I asked. Maybe I was just being neighborly. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that last night was nothing, that I could sit with him and feel normal. He nodded and settled into the wicker chair across from me, stretching his legs out like he belonged there. We talked about easy things. At first, his job at the auto shop, my garden, the way the neighborhood kids used to play kickball in the street. But the conversation slowed and the quiet between us grew thick like it had in the truck. I sipped my tea, my hands wrapped tight around the mug, and tried to ignore the way my pulse quickened. "You seem different lately, Evelyn," he said suddenly. His voice soft, like he was afraid to break the moment. I froze the mug halfway to my lips. Different, how I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but it came out shaky. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at me. Not at the porch, not at the street, but at me. "I don't know," he said. "Quieter, maybe, like you're carrying something heavy." His eyes were steady, searching, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. I wanted to laugh it off, to say he was imagining things, but the words stuck in my throat. "I'm fine," I said finally. The same lie I always told, but he didn't look away, and the weight of his gaze made me feel bare, like he could see every crack in the life I'd built. "Are you?" he asked, and there was something in his voice, something gentle, but probing, like he was reaching for a truth I wasn't ready to give. I set my mug down, my hands trembling, and looked out at the street. The drizzle had stopped, but the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. "It's just life," I said, forcing a smile. "You get to my age, things get quiet." He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched me, and I felt a pull, like a tide dragging me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. "You deserve more than quiet," he said, and the words hit me like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through every part of me. I laughed sharp and nervous and stood up, brushing my hands on my skirt. "You're too kind, Tom," I said, but my voice was thin, and I couldn't meet his eyes. He stood too, stepping closer, and for a moment, I thought he might reach for me, might touch my arm, or say something that would tip us over an edge I hadn't even known was there. But he didn't. He just nodded, his expression unreadable, and said, "I'll let you get back to your evening." He turned to go, but at the edge of the porch, he paused and looked back. "If you ever need to talk, Evelyn, I'm right next door." It was a simple thing, something anyone might say, but the way he said it, the way his eyes held mine, made it feel like more, like an invitation. I nodded, my throat tight, and watched him walk back to his house, his silhouette fading into the dusk. I sat back down, my tea cold now, and stared at the bag of cookies on the table. My heart was still racing, and I felt a mix of shame and exhilaration, like I'd just stepped back from a cliff. When was the last time someone had looked at me like that? Noticed me, really noticed the way Tom did. I thought of Carl, of the way he'd come home last night, barely glancing at me as he mumbled about work. I thought of the years stretching behind us, the ones ahead, and how they felt like a long, empty road. And I thought of Tom's voice, soft and steady, saying I deserved more. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay beside Carl, listening to his even breathing, and felt a restlessness I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to run next door, to knock on Tom's door, and tell him what? That he was right, that I was lonely, that his kindness had cracked something open inside me, something I'd buried years ago. But another part of me, the part that remembered my vows, my life, the woman I was supposed to be, wanted to lock the door and never see him again. I was caught, suspended between two versions of myself, and I didn't know which one would win. The days after Tom's visit on the porch felt like walking through fog. I went through my routines, watering the roses, folding laundry, cooking dinner for Carl, but everything seemed off, like a radio, tuned just shy of the station. I kept expecting to see Tom dreading it and hoping for it at the same time. I'd catch myself glancing at his parents' house, watching for his truck, and then scold myself for being so foolish. I was 67, not some lovesick girl. But the ache in my chest didn't care about age. It was raw, insistent, like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. Carl noticed something was wrong, though he didn't say it outright. He'd look at me over his newspaper, his brow furrowing, and ask if I was feeling okay. Just tired, I'd say, and he'd nod accepting it, because it was easier than digging deeper. I wanted to tell him about the ride in the rain, about Tom's words, about the loneliness that had been eating at me for years. But how do you say that to someone you've lived with for decades? How do you admit you're drowning in the life you built together? So I stayed quiet, and the distance between us grew a silent chasm filled with things we'd never say. It was a week later when I saw Tom again. I was coming back from the grocery store, walking as always, though the sky was clear this time. He was in his driveway, washing his truck, the hose spraying a fine mist that caught the sunlight. He waved me over, and my heart lurched. I could have kept walking, could have smiled and said I had things to do. But my feet carried me across the street like they had a mind of their own. "Looking like a nice day," I said, shielding my eyes from the sun. He turned off the hose and grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sure is. You need a hand with those bags?" I shook my head, clutching them tighter, and we stood there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken things. He looked at me, his eyes soft but searching, like he was waiting for something. "Evelyn," he said, finally, his voice low. "I meant what I said the other night. About you, deserving more. I see you out here day after day, and I don't know. It feels like you're waiting for something that's never gonna come." His words cut deeper than I expected, slicing through the careful walls I'd built. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that my life was fine, that I was fine. But the truth was there, heavy and undeniable, and his saying it out loud made it real in a way I couldn't ignore. I looked down at the pavement, my throat tight. "You don't know me, Tom," I said, but it sounded weak, like I was trying to convince myself. "I know enough," he said, stepping closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I felt the warmth of him, the pull of his presence. "I know you're kind. I know you smile even when you don't want to. And I know you're lonely even if you won't say it." His voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it, a question he wasn't asking outright. My heart pounded, and I felt that same tide from before dragging me towards something dangerous, something I wasn't sure I could come back from. I don't know how long we stood there, the world narrowing to the space between us. I thought of Carl, of the life we'd promised each other, of the years that had worn us down like stones in a river. I thought of Tom, of the way he saw me, really saw me, in a way I'd forgotten was possible. And I thought of myself, not the wife, not the mother, but Evelyn, the woman who was still here, still feeling, still wanting. My hands trembled, and I felt the weight of a choice I hadn't realized I was making. "Tom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, and his eyes were steady, waiting. I could have stepped forward. I could have let the tide take me, let his warmth fill the empty spaces Carl had left behind. For a moment, I wanted to God I wanted to. But then I saw the ring on my finger, glinting in the sunlight, and something inside me snapped back like a rubber band stretched too far. I can't, I said, shaking my head. I'm sorry. I can't. His face didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something, disappointment, maybe, or understanding. He nodded, slow and deliberate, and took a step back. Okay, he said simply. I'm still here, though, if you ever change your mind. He turned back to his truck, picking up the hose, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break. I walked home, my bags heavy in my arms, and let myself into the house. It was quiet as always, the clock ticking in the living room. I set the groceries on the counter and sank into a chair, my hands still shaking. I felt like I'd just run a marathon, my chest tight with a mix of relief and regret. I'd pulled back from the edge, but the edge was still there, and I knew I'd see it every time I looked at Tom, every time I felt the weight of my own loneliness. That night, when Carl came home, I watched him hang his coat, his movements slow and familiar. He looked tired, older than I remembered, and for the first time in years, I felt a pang of tenderness for him. Not love, exactly. Not the kind we'd had when we were young, but something softer, something worn and real. I thought about telling him everything about Tom, about the ride in the rain, about the moment I almost crossed a line. But I didn't. Some things are better left unsaid, not because they're wrong, but because they're too fragile to survive the telling. Instead, I stood up and walked over to him. Rough day. I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked at me, surprised, like he'd forgotten I was there. Yeah, he said, rubbing his neck. You okay? I nodded. And for a moment, our eyes met, and I wondered if he saw me, really saw me, even just a little. I'm okay, I said, and this time it felt closer to the truth. I never told Tom I was grateful for his kindness or that it woke something in me I thought was gone. I never told Carl how close I came to losing myself, but I carry that day with me like a stone in my pocket, smooth and heavy. It wasn't about betrayal, not really. It was about remembering I'm still here, still a woman, still capable of feeling something bright and sharp and alive. And maybe that's enough to know it's there, even if I never touch it again. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might understand, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Evelyn's place? Thanks for watching.